And welcome to Neverwinter Mod. So very surprisingly to note, Cryptic Studios have actually removed scaling from a lot of the zones. We can see we're in Undermountain right now, we're in Willowwood, and there's no scaling. I can deal as much damage as I want here and just annihilate the enemies. And we can teleport to similar zones. For example, Dreadring. We all knew this used to be scaled, not anymore. Same with all of your Elemental Evil locations. You can see also not scaled. Now, I don't know if this is a mistake on Cryptic Studios' behalf, but looking throughout all the different zones that you can access, the majority of them are now unscaled. No longer are you having your item level forcibly reduced and thus reducing your hit points and damage, which definitely feels pretty good. And in my opinion, I don't see why there really would be scaling in zones, since you don't really need to keep the difficulty of those zones up to par, since the loot from these areas is pretty much non-existent. You just do questing for certain campaigns and that's about it. And why wouldn't you be able to kill enemies easier when you upgrade your character through item level? You can see even Barovia now is unscaled. Same with your Chult areas. Now, does this mean Cryptic Studios are going to remove scaling entirely from the game? What would happen, let's say they did? Let's say they removed scaling from all of our dungeon queues and our skirmishes and even our trials. What would happen to the balance? What would the game have to do? Well, you see there are certain items which you can obtain as rewards from doing certain content. And these are premium items. You can see a list of them here. And these items normally you'd only be able to obtain, let's say, from the Zen market. For example, preservation wards, mountain companion upgrade tokens, albeit you can get those with trade bars as well. But these kind of things are not items they want us to be able to obtain very easily. For example, if they did go and remove scaling from all the content here, what would happen realistically? Would you guys still run, let's say, Fanbreaker Island when it takes you like 20 minutes to complete versus Lair of Lostmouth, which when unscaled you complete in 5 minutes? And in the end, they all just give the same chance to give you these premium drops. And even still, if the content becomes so easy to run because they remove scaling, you think they're going to allow you to complete that content really quickly and thus be able to get these items like really easily and thus devaluing them and thus making it no sense at all to buy them from the Zen market when you can just farm a dungeon for 2 minutes and get those drops all of the time? No, they can't allow that. They have to have the difficulty at a certain level so that it requires a certain amount of time to complete. And how do they do that? With scaling. It allows them to easily prevent power creep through the gain of item level, and thus they can introduce higher and higher item level gear without the fear of making all this content easier and easier over time. Of course, they can go the opposite route and just scale up the enemies, make the difficulty harder. But yes, that would then mean the devs would have to go through each of this content every time they come out with new stuff to then increase the HP and damage of the enemies to compensate for the increase of power of players. And that would then even make the gap further and further between new players still being able to complete the content and older players being able to just steamroll it. Scaling allows them to avoid that massive gap between a new player and an older player. But you of course will still have a gap because an older player will know what powers to choose and when to use them, along with having gear that gives them better stats. But at least you're not getting such a massive difference in damage due to a massive difference in item level. Or they could just introduce different levels of difficulties of each of those dungeons. If they did that, where you would go and queue up to a dungeon and you would choose in match options to increase difficulty and thus increase reward, would that help? For random queues, no. People as random queues don't want to be having to select match options to make it harder and then not even complete. People already struggle with certain content in these random queues. And in the end, if you're completing that content for rewards, there's no real reason why you wouldn't use the match option to increase the difficulty and thus increase the reward. And that's basically what you're doing anyway by scaling yourself to complete this content, to get decent rewards. Would you prefer an option to be able to complete it really easily but get no rewards? Sounds a bit silly to me. Of course, removing scaling would make certain content really easy and certain content really hard, and then why would we run any of the content within there? We'd always just want to run the easiest thing. The game would get real boring after you just run the same thing again and again, and on top of that, the game won't allow you to get good rewards by completing something very easily. So what scaling does right now is make the majority of these dungeons, skirmishes and trials on kind of an equal level of completion rates. Your loot is balanced around that completion time, and when everything here is a completion time of average of 25 minutes, then all of these dungeons pretty much drop the same rate of loot. You can look in advanced dungeons and you can see like Vault of Stars is 45 minutes, and thus the loot is a bit better in there. So with the removal of scaling, what would happen is you would end up with Module 17 back with Tower of the Mad Mage. Only the hardest content would have good loot, and the rest would all have shitty loot because it's so easy to complete anyway that the devs don't want to put any good premium loot in there because you'd end up devaluing it all. And when content's really easy and let's say it has a unique companion, let's say they introduce the Paranoid Delusion to the Money Coins Bank heist, remove scaling so you can complete it within 3 minutes, what would happen to the price of the Paranoid Delusion? Even though everybody in the game wants it, at least some DPS classes, the price of it would plummet and it would become like an Energon, the dirt cheapest epic companion there is, and you'll make no money off it. It's not like the loot will be any good anymore. Since it can be so easy to complete, any loot you get in there will sell for pennies because there'll be so much of it in the market, nobody will need it. So only the content that takes time to complete, that takes effort, and thus being hard, will be rewarding. What the game does is try to balance the time it takes for the rewards you get, and that's what they use scaling for. Of course, they could use an entirely different system to try and balance that, but this is what they do to enable top tier players to be matched with lower tiered players so that they can still play together and get a reasonable amount of time to complete, and the new player paired with that endgame player can at least somewhat feel effective and not have like a massive difference of times 100 damage compared to them and everybody's just running ahead of them and they just feel completely useless just tagging behind. That's what it was before Mod 16. Personally, how do I feel about scaling? I feel there's no real other way to make older content viable without it. They could use a different method of upscaling enemies depending on the challenge of your players, and thus we don't actually see the impact on our characters, but we will still feel the enemies dealing the same amount of damage. They gotta do it some way or another, whether it's reducing our characters' effectiveness or just increasing the enemy's effectiveness, their damage, their hit points, so that content still takes a reasonable amount of time to complete so they can reward us for that time we take to complete it. They will not allow you to farm companion upgrade tokens or mount upgrade tokens or unbind tokens very easily. They can't allow that for their own economy. Anyway, enough said. I just wanted to give my 2 cents with regards to the scaling in the game, why it's here, and what would happen if they actually went and removed it all. We'd end up like Module 17 again. I think a lot of newer players, anybody who couldn't go into Tower of the Mad Mage and take advantage of the massive amounts of profit players were making, felt a little bit hard done by it, as the rest of the game didn't have much loot going for it. But alas, I definitely enjoyed my time back with Tower of the Mad Mage. I had good fun making lots of Astral Diamonds, as I was one of the lucky few to be able to join groups and complete it. So personally, sure, I'd like to go back to then, but I don't think it would be a good thing for the game. New players need to have the ability to get what they need in all sorts of different content. It's good to have diversity. You can't just have one piece of content that's best to run in order to get your loot. That gets pretty boring pretty fast. So with that aside, I'd like to give a special thank you to all of my channel members for helping me keep my channel going. And if I presented this well, consider leaving the video a like. And if you're new around here, consider subscribing. We'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.